Game design. It's not just for kids. Games aren't just for kids anymore. Look at me. I play games, right? So this talk with Robin Koman is the intergenerational game design, the evolving older adult gamer. And you know what? I don't play games like CSGO or Fortnite or any of that stuff anymore because my reflexes are just not what they used to be. But yeah, I'm excited for this talk, Robin. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, man, I totally feel you.
Awesome. I will back out of here and let you have your way with everybody.
Awesome. All right. So excited to be here. And shout out to Kristen for being here first. So let me go ahead and make sure, perfect, that we can see what's going on screen here. So we're here to talk about intergenerational game design. We're just going to jump right in. I've got quite a bit to cover in the time that we have, and I'm happy to open things up for questions as well. So we're going to talk about a few different...
The screen is black. I can't see anything.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right. Well, we'll rock it this way just to make sure folks can see what's going on. Thanks for letting me know, Dan.
Try it one more time, and then let's see if it does it.
Sure.
Nope, it's just again? Black. Just black. Darn it. That's okay.
It's all good.
All right.
So we are going to define the older adult, because you may be wondering exactly what that means, because, you know, with Dan talking about his reflexes, I certainly have that feeling too. I'm not technically an older adult gamer yet, but I am not as speedy on the twitchy reflexy stuff as I used to be, for sure. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I want to also talk about just the two different ways to think about game design in older adults. One is it's an accessibility issue, right? So how can we, regardless of who you're creating content for, how can we make games that are accessible to older adults as well, so that you can kind of add them into your audience? And then I want to shift and talk specifically about this idea of designing experiences for older adults. So what are some things we need to keep in mind from a game design perspective if we're targeting older adults specifically, to make sure that they are going to be engaged with the products that we create? So we are going to start with, as I said, that definition of older adult. I love this image of probably someone's grandpa wonderfully looking at an iPhone. I like to think, you know, rocking away on probably like a little card game or dice game, but maybe he's hopped in Fortnite, who knows. When we're talking about this idea of older adult, technically what we're looking at are folks that are over the age of 50. And so when you think about this in relationship to, you know, design approaches, there are certain changes that happen. They happen to us in our physiology in terms of reflexes and endurance and strength that we're going to talk about in a moment here, in our vision and our hearing, even in the way that we think and process information, that are more noticeable in folks that are 50 plus. But I think what's critical for us as game designers to think about is that the changes that happen related to aging actually start way earlier than that. And so you can actually look, in some cases, as early as your late 20s to early 30s, and see age-related changes already starting to happen. And again, those are changes that we'll talk about predominantly more on the vision, hearing, and reflex side than the cognitive side, but we'll talk about that a little bit more. So what kind of really led to me focusing on this particular area as somebody who's super passionate about diversity in games and accessibility in games, what led me here was just a realization of how many players in our player base are actually starting to experience age-related changes that could affect how they play and the kind of games that they want to play. And so I am certainly in and amongst those folks, as I mentioned, that are seeing some changes. And so right now, according to some statistics from the Entertainment Software Association, 41% of the folks that are buying and playing games are 35 and older, which means it's really likely that they're starting to see some changes, whether major or minor, in again, cognition, vision, reflexes, etc. And so I would look at it this way, right? The beginnings of the game industry, right? Space War, the first, like we'll say mass produced, it wasn't really that mass, but the first real arcade machine was released in 1971. The Odyssey, the first console, came out a year later. And so somebody who was a kid, say maybe 12 years old or so, when these two parts of our industry took off, they're in their 60s now, right? Somebody whose first console was the NES when they were 12, 50 now, right? And so folks who are, like many of us, people who grew up with the game industry and had this wonderful opportunity to, grow with the industry from the start, are now older adults, and we can do a better job creating games that they'll be able to enjoy playing. So let's start on this topic of designing for accessibility, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat. It's so nice to see everybody who's here, Kristen and Lisette, David, Arcilis. So if you have questions, you're welcome to throw them into the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on it as we go, but I'll also do some Q&A at the end. So when thinking about designing for accessibility, and I think you could apply these generally, not just specifically to older adults, but certainly applying to older adults. I like to start off with motor changes, just because I think that's what folks think about first, right? I call that low-hanging fruit, right? So they think about, reflexes slowing down, and not being able to respond as twitchily to that opposing player or maybe to that QTE as they would have in the past. And so that is definitely a part of it. And I think a part that for those of us who are, pretty competitive as gamers, certainly becomes frustrating, is something that, again, you might notice as early as your early to mid 30s. Part of the good news here is that doing things that are really manually dexterous and manually demanding, like playing games, can help to stave this off a bit. But it is something that's going to happen. What you may not be aware of, because again, it's not, I think, as commonly known, is that it's not just changes to reflexes that happen as we get older. Accuracy is heavily affected. So when you think about somebody, for an example, using a mouse to click on the right element quickly, or tapping on the right element quickly on a tablet or a smartphone, and this is always the example that pops into my head, in a game like Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where maybe you're using a joystick to steer a cursor around and select a menu option. As you get older, that fine level of accuracy diminishes, and it can actually be trickier to hit the intended target on the first try. And so, if you have elements that are packed too tightly, for an example, you might make it really tricky for a player to be able to actually trigger the interaction that they want. Sometimes it's not a big deal, but if failing to be accurate, leads to using the wrong spell or making the wrong reaction or wasting a resource, obviously that kind of stuff can become very frustrating. In addition, as we get older, our strength and flexibility drops a bit. And so I think there's a few different ways that we can think about this. The current generation of games may not be quite as typically as physically demanding as maybe like the Wii era would have been, with the Wiimote or with the PlayStation Move. But we still have just the issue of holding a controller, for an example, if we'd like to play on console, that has a certain weight to it, and where we're kind of positioning our bodies with that weight, or holding a tablet or a smartphone for a prolonged window of time, right? So strength can become an issue where, it might become painful, or it may even, to a certain extent, become impossible to hold a certain item for a certain length of time, which has interesting implications perhaps about how long we plan for an individual session of play to be satisfying compared to a full-length game. And we'll get into that more in a bit. Endurance is another big one. You think about how much repetitive movement games ask of us, especially in more reflex-intensive genres. over and over and over again, right? And not just individual button pushes, but combinations of movement. Like we're pushing bumpers, we're pushing triggers, we're hitting different buttons. And so for the older adult player, they're only going to be able to do that for so long before fatigue or pain begins to become an issue. And obviously those things are going to exacerbate are going to exacerbate the reflex issue as well, right? Because it's just going to basically lead to us slowing down. So obviously when we're trying to make something more accessible on this motor level, there are tons of different ways that we can come at this. One of the major ways, and you know, in and amongst others, you can thank the wonderful folks at the IGDA Accessibilities Group for really driving this home over the years. One of the major ways is through control scheme accommodation, right? Which is just making sure that we are affording the player the ability to map certain things to their preference, so that if they do have some kind of obstacle on a physiological level, that they can design a control scheme to fit their needs. In addition to allowing for control scheme modification, again, you think about that length of play versus individual session of play, right? And I give this example. When I'm playing something on my smartphone, right? Because I play across all different platforms. I play on mobile, I play on PC, I play on console. When I'm playing a game on my smartphone, you know, maybe I'm playing something like Assemble with Care or Media Zone, right? I can spend 10 to 15 minutes, get something done that feels rewarding. And then if I need to take a break, either because of time or because I am tired of holding my phone, I can step away. It's relatively easy to save my progress. And then when I step back in, whenever I'm ready, I have that ability to continue without an amazing or significant loss of progress, right? I compare that to something like Breath of the Wild. And I will admit, I definitely get distracted at times in Breath of the Wild, which becomes kind of a Breath of the Wild snap experience for me, for those of you who are photo game fans. But I can easily play for, you know, an hour and a half to 3 hours and maybe still be mid-quest, not necessarily feel like I've gotten something done. And again, still in the case of that game, relatively easy to save your progress, so it makes it a little bit safer to step away and step back in. But it's clearly designed for longer sessions of play. And so when you know you're targeting an older adult audience, it can be useful to plan for those shorter sessions of play in mind. I think also from a control scheme and HUD perspective, try not to pack elements together too tightly. So that, again, if my accuracy is lower, that if I misclick or mistap, perhaps I've just hit kind of open screen versus accidentally triggering something that I didn't intend to trigger. So a couple of different questions that have come up here. I think just in interest of time, I'm going to hold off on those till the end, but I will absolutely come back to those because I see some great questions already. Thanks, Zachariah and Kristen, for that. So we're going to move on to vision changes. And so again, just looking at sort of the typical changes that occur in vision as we age. And again, these kinds of changes in vision can happen for a lot of different reasons. They aren't just related to aging, but are ones that we typically see in older adults. So big things are shrinkage in peripheral vision over time and central vision over time. And so we kind of lose that crispness in peripheral and central vision. And so when you think about this, for an example, in regards to placement of HUD-based elements, we'll talk about that a bit in a moment. And so that shrinkage and loss of sort of crispness are things that we have to contend with. In addition, and I saw this mentioned in the chat and I couldn't agree more, when you think about placing font in a world, right? And think about how busy some of the virtual worlds are that we create. Really thinking about the size of that font and the style of that font is enormously important. Using, for an example, mixed sentence case versus all caps in font can be tremendously helpful in making things more readable and clear to somebody who perhaps is having, again, just sort of the natural deteriorations in vision that occur as we get older. Really thinking through the color usage, so making sure that you're not picking colors that perhaps are too close to one another. And then, obviously from a contrast perspective, that can be differentiated easily from the background. We don't want to distract, certainly, from what's going on in the game, but we do want to make sure that we're not putting kind of unnecessary challenges in the way when it comes to players being able to take in the information that we're offering to them. And again, a lot of this is dependent upon the genre of game that you're creating, right? Some of those games are very HUD heavy and others are less so. And so, if you jump back to an example like, Breath of the Wild, you have hearts that you might be tracking, you have stamina that you might be tracking, right? In other games like Assassin's Creed, you might have quests and objectives that are popping up. And on the pro side, a lot of these games offer, amongst other accessibility options, offer the ability to kind of tailor your heads-up display to really shape what it is you're seeing from one moment to the next as you play. And so just making sure that you have considered the size, the placement to accommodate for those vision issues is really important. So I just out of the corner of my vision saw somebody talking about camera control and how controlling movement and controlling camera is something that players who are less experienced with modern games actually have to learn and think about very purposefully. I promise we will come to that, Tara, when we talk about designing experiences specifically for older adults. In terms of camera here, I wanted to talk for a moment about camera choices and just in terms of fixed cameras versus player controlled cameras, camera movement speed and camera movement speed options. Because one of the interesting things that happens as players get older is motion sickness becomes more of an issue. And for some of us, and I'll just confess, myself included, you may have dealt with motion sickness issues for your entire life. And maybe there are certain types of games. For me, it's first person games tend to trigger it more badly than any other kind. But the issues between what your brain is taking in visually and your vestibular system, right? It's like all of those wonderful components of your hearing, basically. There's this disconnect that triggers motion sickness, to put it simply. And so knowing that older adults are more susceptible to motion sickness potentially might, again, point toward making different choices with camera, right? So when you think about games back in the day, like a Resident Evil or a God of War, that would have done some stuff with fixed camera angles, for an example, could be a way to help to avoid some of those problems. And again, certain genres of games, point and click adventure games, hidden object games, because there is less frenetic camera movement and usually sort of a pre-designed camera path or even a snap, would be less likely to cause those kinds of motion sickness issues, which is fantastic. So again, I'll come back to this idea of your heads-up display. And so obviously different genres of games have different styles of approach when it comes to heads-up display. And so you might have, games that have little to no traditional HUD as we would think of it. One of my favorite games of all time is that game company's Journey, which you can play on a variety of platforms now. And when you look at a game like that, depending on the platform you're playing it on, in terms of HUD, you might really just have, an indication of how to access a pause menu in the top corner of the screen, and that's really it. I would encourage you, for those of you that are interested in whether it's accessibility broadly or it's accessibility specifically for older adults, get in the habit of playing games you love through that lens, right? When you think about the changes that happen in vision and hearing, and kind of keep yourself in that mindset as you're playing games that you really enjoy, you'll begin to pick out issues that you might not otherwise have noticed. And so, like I mentioned with Journey, and if you have a chance to play it on mobile, that you can really see this, like the icon that they have for their pause menu is just 3 faint lines in the top left corner where it's placed. And with the low contrast of placement, you really run the risk of, one, from the peripheral shrinkage standpoint, a player not even seeing that indicator. And 2, from a contrast standpoint, it just blending into the background. And so, again, while you don't want these elements to distract the player from the world, you certainly want to make sure that you can allow the player to access necessary functionality and to access necessary information that they're looking for. So that brings us to hearing and accessibility. And so, just like we talked about with vision, there's some typical types of hearing loss that happen as we age. And so number one, and again, we can see this at a variety of ages, depending on how kind folks are to their ears, is noise-related hearing loss. And so noise-related hearing loss is really just looking at the fact that as we're exposed to a variety of loud sounds from different circumstances, right? Whether it's music or working in a high noise career, maybe like construction, for an example, where we'll damage the cilia that line our ear. Those don't regenerate. And so we can have some hearing loss that is just basically wear and tear over time that occurs. And so obviously, if you don't treat your ears kindly, you can accelerate that type of hearing loss. And then there's presbycusis, which is just sort of normal hearing loss that occurs over time. Again, I think not necessarily related to noise, but certainly you could conceptualize as just sort of that wear and tear that does occur over time. And so the way that these two things are typically going to manifest themselves most quickly are higher pitch sounds. So we start to lose upper frequencies of our hearing sooner than other areas of our hearing. And then what I call distinguishing conflicting sounds. So when you think about games and how often we are, how would I say it, put into a scenario where we're listening to music, there are sound effects going on in the world, and we have players or characters that are talking to one another. And all of those sounds are going on at the same time. As we get older, we begin to have a diminishment in our ability to separate those sounds from one another and really focus in on what it is we want to hear. And so, I think there's a couple of different ways that you can come at this problem. Again, I think it's always good to give credit where credit is due. I think that when you look at the kind of accessibility movement within our industry, one of the things that is very commonly advocated for is utilizing closed captioning instead of just subtitles, right? And so for those of you who either maybe don't have any kind of hearing issues or never really thought about hearing and accessibility, the difference there obviously is that with with subtitles, we're just getting information about dialogue, right? And so we're again, if it's capturing players speaking, that's impressive. But if it's characters who have kind of pre-scripted dialogue, we can offer that content to the player. Subtitles, on the other hand, are not just going to give us that pre-scripted dialogue, but are also going to give us written indications of things that are happening in the soundscape of the world. And so when we're looking at basically, sound effects that are occurring, like the rumbling in the air ducts in a Dead Space game, right? Or a shift in music that maybe is meant to warn us that something is about to happen, right? Maybe we've stumbled onto a room that's going to have some amazing fight in it, and there's a sweeping change in the music. Subtitles allow us to communicate some of that information to the player as well, so that basically they, as I see kind of popping up here and again in the chat, is that it's fair, right? That players have access to the same information as a player without some kind of hearing barrier would have. In addition to subtitles, the thing I'm always going to champion is choice. So if it is possible from a scope perspective, when you're creating options for your game, if you know that you're going to have a variety of sound sources, again, sound effects, music, dialogue, don't just have a universal volume slider or a universal toggle on and off all sound. Allow the player to choose, right? Let them have those sliders that allow them to tune the volume of music versus sound effects versus dialogue. Allow the player to have, that toggle on and off for music, sound effects, dialogue, so that they can customize the soundscape to their needs, right? So they don't have to lose sort of, the body of these wonderful sound effects and voiced performances and musical pieces that you've created. But it's also not just a cacophony for them. And so, again, these things obviously take time and thus can have a cost associated with them. But I think any potential cost is far outweighed by the benefit. I think probably as good a time as any for those of you who are and usually in a talk like this, I get folks that are, if not really excited about the idea of older adults in gaming, at least open to the idea of older adults in gaming. But if you are a skeptic and you're here and you're just like, why would I bother? Is it enough of an audience? There have been a few really big studies that have been done by, of all things, the American Association of Retired Persons, where they look at basically pulling their enormous audience base in relationship to their gaming habits. And in 2016, with thousands of respondents, they found that players over the age of 50 were spending about $530 million a year on games, which again, is a huge amount of money. Having done that and found those results in 2016, they did a new study in 2019. They released the results of last year. And the profit margin of purchases in relationship to games had jumped from 530 million to over $3 billion in a year. And so obviously there's an enormous amount of potential profitability. I think a big thing that's driving this, as we talked about earlier, is that when you think about who the older adult gamer is, that's changed quite a bit in the last few years, right? Older members of Gen X who were born, maybe in the mid to late 1960s into the early 1970s are hitting their 50s and have been playing games perhaps their whole life and want to continue to play games. But even older generations, baby boomers and members of the silent generation are playing games. And so whether they maybe would have played them, as teens or young adults obviously would vary, but certainly the audience is here. And so I think that, if nothing else, helps to justify why we might take the time and thus obviously spend the money to build in some of these accessibility features to make games more playable. So next I want to talk about the cognitive side of things. And so again, I'll start where I think people typically think about cognition, older adults, which is memory, right? And so I think there's the assumption that older adults are going to have, significant changes in short-term and long-term memory. And, can we or can't we accommodate for maybe someone who isn't going to learn through the practice of play in the same way that a younger player might. And so first, I will say, sure, yes, our memory does change somewhat as we age. And I'm not talking about any kind of condition like dementia or Alzheimer's, but particularly in short-term memory, as we get older, and it's certainly more noticeable in our 50s and onward than in our 30s or 40s, there is some shift in how quickly something gets into our short-term memory and how long we are able to kind of pull from that and recall how to respond or react in a given situation. Changes to our long-term storage, where we have something that's ingrained knowledge and that we really should be able to pull from, for even decades after we've learned something. Changes in that type of memory really are typically indicative of some kind of illness or injury. And so it's less likely to be something that we would need to try to design for. But changes to short-term memory are certainly something that we can look at and make some adjustments around. And so for me, I always think about the experienced player versus the player for whom a particular type of game is going to be a novel situation, right? So something that they haven't done before. And so I think this is one of the places where the way that what an older adult gamer looks like has evolved is really impactful. Because again, 10 years ago, we're talking about an older adult gamer, and it is possible that most of what modern gaming has to offer is in some way novel. And so we need to have more kind of separate and distinct tutorials set into those experiences, and perhaps give players the option to re-engage with tutorials, whether that's having a separate, discrete tutorial structure that a player can access as they choose, or that's having tooltips or little advice snippets that would pop up that a player could choose to toggle on and off to help them move something from short-term memory into long-term storage more effectively, again, for something that's totally new. When you think about today's older adult gamer, that gamer who's in their early 50s, again, these are Gen-Xers who grew up playing games, right? Who maybe started gaming with the NES or the SNES and understand controllers and maybe have been playing PC games. And even though they might be showing decline in certain areas, in and around reflex, for example, or maybe don't have as much time to spend playing games as a young adult or a teen gamer might, they still have this long-term storage-based knowledge, what we sometimes call crystallized intelligence, right? That they can pull from when they're playing games, so that these aren't necessarily truly novel situations, which means that the degree perhaps of tutorial access that they would need might be less. Another way to think about this is in relationship to the introduction practice mastery pattern, which maybe some of you have heard before. The idea that as we're introducing a player to our world and to different types of mechanics, that we can kind of create this lovely layering effect. And if you want to look at a classic example, look at the works of Shigeru Miyamoto. He really is like because I'll say the father, saying the grandfather makes me feel really old. The father of this pattern, right, where we introduce a player to a few things, and to the earlier comment, if it's a player who's never played a game before where they have to control player movement and the camera at the same time, then we introduce them to that idea, right? We give them a chance to move around in the space and look around in the space, perhaps with not much else going on, so that we don't panic them or force them into a failure. And then we introduce something new, right? We add some layer of challenge, some aspect of gameplay, and we allow them to practice those in concert as we're layering in, introducing new mechanics and giving them a chance to practice those and working toward mastery, right? And they'll be showing mastery of some of those skills while we're still layering in other new ones and building that sense of challenge over time. I think, again, when you think about this in relationship to designing for older adults, that introduction, practice, mastery pattern still works. It's the pacing at which you move from one of those steps to the next, and the pacing at which you layer in those new mechanics that you'll likely need to slow down to a certain extent, right? And again, the extent to which you need to slow it down is certainly going to vary depending on the genre of game, depending on that sort of specific audience of older adult gamers that you're targeting. But just in general, just based on what we've talked about so far in relationship to reflexes and endurance, in relationship to memory, really behooves us to slow things down just a bit, to make sure that we're not overwhelming the player, that we're not creating an experience that's more stressful than we intended it to be. So that brings us to the designing experiences side. So now that we've looked at some of the ways that we change as we age and some of the ways that we can kind of accommodate for that, regardless of whatever core audience you might be targeting, what if we were specifically designing experiences for older adults? And I wanted to address a question. Let me jump back and see if I can see who it was from. Kristen Mueller had a great question. What are the game companies out there primarily focusing on this crowd? And so I would say if you look at the companies who have really purposefully focused in on cultivating the older adult gamer, look at companies like PopCap and Big Fish and their subsidiaries who really have kind of made a name for themselves on creating what we would, I guess in the past, have called a more casual experience, but definitely a typically narratively driven experience that is less reflex intensive, and that wonderfully for us from a memory standpoint and a learning standpoint models a lot of what you see in classic point and click adventure games from that sort of golden era, late 80s to early 90s, that a lot of these folks would have been playing, right? They were young adults or teenagers sort of during that golden era. And so there are some companies out there, I wouldn't say there's enough, because there's quite a big audience of older adult folks playing games, but if I had to kind of point at a few, I think those folks have definitely done an amazing job. I was actually just talking to somebody the other day about the memory side of things and sort of designing for challenge. And there's a Big Fish game called Drawn the Painted Tower that I think makes a lot of choices that are really great for a variety of audiences, but particularly for the older adult dealing with novel situations and perhaps avoiding frustration. And one of the things that they have is a really robust hint system that basically allows for the older adult to to skip certain things, which I know might sound unusual to us. It's not typically, as game designers, necessarily what we think about. It's just letting a player get past something. But they teach through their hint system in a way that they're still preparing the player for challenges that will come up later, which I think is a really interesting way to approach that problem. So when we think about designing experiences, right, a big thing for me is making sure that the experience I create has a challenge that I intend. So making sure that I'm not creating a game that is going to make a player so anxious or so frustrated that they feel like they can't continue to play. And so that obviously brings us to flow theory. So if you're not familiar with the work of Csikszentmihalyi and you are interested in game design, I would heartily recommend that you read the great book Flow. Flow is the brainchild of a really brilliant psychologist named Csikszentmihalyi. And it's basically this idea that in certain experiences, we can get into this state of focus where we're just engaged and we're feeling fulfilled and we're enjoying ourselves. And flow theory basically looks at the qualities an experience needs to have in order to be likely to evoke this flow state, or one of a few other related mental states that can be really satisfying, like relaxation or control or emotional arousal. And so one of the qualities that is required for flow, what we might think of as this sort of perfect balance of achievability in the face of challenge, is focus. And cognitively, as we age, research shows focus actually becomes more challenging. So why? Well, there are changes that happen in cognition. It seems to be related to a few different pieces. So one of those is short-term memory, which we've already talked about. Another is what's called fluid intelligence. And so I mentioned crystallized intelligence earlier, right? So it's sort of like the kind of schema of knowledge that we build up through our whole lives that we have that we can pull from in terms of long-term memory. Fluid intelligence is our ability to recognize patterns and to problem solve in the immediate, in novel situations rapidly, right? And so our fluid intelligence tends to decline a bit as we age. Cognitively, our processing speed, how quickly we're processing all the different sensory information that we take in, tends to slow a bit as we age. And those two things paired together have a direct connection to what's called focused attention. So our ability to notice the things that we need to notice and to respond in an effective window of time. And so I'm sure somebody's going to ask, there isn't really a ton of gaming related research that's been done specifically on the impact of a loss of focus. And it's one of those areas I'm really interested in, and amongst some other things I'm researching, it's one of the areas that I'm researching in. And so if you're interested in designing experiences for older adults specifically, learning how to combat the changes that happen with focus, and maybe where this indicates that we should be going for pleasant but non-flow mental states, has some really interesting implications for game design, right? Because again, flow is predicated on this idea that we are going to be perpetually challenged and that our performance will improve over time in the face of that challenge. And so if we're not going for flow anymore, what other types of experiences might we create, right? And so two other mental states that Csikszentmihalyi addresses are control, where we're actually able to perform in excess of the challenge that we face. And so we feel like we can kind of dominate and be sort of secure in our ability to win. And that seems to be quite appealing to older adult players. It's not to say that they don't want challenge. And I've seen some folks mentioning older adult players. And if you do some Googling, you will find like some really charming YouTubers. There's the one I always think of is the Skyrim grandma. But there's also a competitive esports team called the Silver Snipers. So there are definitely, there's still a desire for competition. again, I think as has been mentioned in the chat a few times, is this competition fair, right? Can we create something with a level playing field, where perhaps, a different mode of playing that's a little bit more slow, more strategic, can win out at times against maybe more frenetic, reflex-driven activity. So in addition to flow and these issues with focus, and I would say, in addition to focus, for those of you who are interested in these cognitive changes, also look into selective attention and its relationship to inattentional blindness. You can also look at divided attention and inattentional blindness, as well as change blindness, right? And so, again, focusing on multiple things at the same time. I'm tracking a reticule. I'm looking at information in my HUD, right? I'm getting an indication on the screen that I'm taking fire from this corner, right? And maybe I've got a buddy yelling in my ear about where I need to shoot. Where we may, when we were younger, be able to manage those components relatively smoothly without it taking too much cognitive capacity, it just becomes challenging as we age. Again, not impossible, and certainly challenging at different rates for different individuals, but broadly speaking, in our 60s, it's going to be a lot more noticeable than it was in our 50s. In our 70s, it's going to be a lot more noticeable than it was in our 60s. So it's just sort of this gradual shift in certain areas that occurs. I also wanted to talk about narrative, and this is maybe an area in relationship to age and design that you hadn't thought about before. This is an area actually that I'm doing quite a bit of research in. I have a survey that's going to be going out soon, and hopefully a paper will be coming out in this next year, specifically on differences in what older adults might be looking for from narrative experiences compared to other audiences of players. And so some things that we've learned already in the research that are probably not hugely surprising, hopefully. One is that we like characters that are kind of like us. And so when you think about player characters, it's really nice to offer customization options, not just in perhaps gender or ethnicity, but also in age, right? And so think about how rarely you see player characters that are actually older, and not as a result of some kind of weird genetics problem like Snake, right? But they're actually older adults. When you look at the body of older adult characters in games, you notice some kind of disturbing trends. And it's certainly not just in games. You see it in other forms of entertainment too. There's a lot of villains that are older, especially older women. You also have a lot of victims. So it seems like, you're either the enemy to be fought or a character to be pitied. And neither one of those necessarily feels very good if that's kind of all of the characters that you're confronted with. When you think about plot, stories about older adults don't always have to be stories of tragedy and decline. There are some games out there, and they're actually really beautiful experiences like The Stillness of the Wind, or The Graveyard, that are very compelling, but inevitably involve decline and death. And again, when you're an older adult, that's not necessarily what you want to think about. and I'll give you an example that I often give to my students. My dad is a late in life gamer. He's in his 70s. And he told me once, Robin, tell your students, when you're old in real life, you don't want to die in games all the time because you're close enough in the real world. And he said it, kind of half joking, but when you think about it really, right? Like, we don't always want to be reminded of our own mortality. We might want instead, arcs of growth or arcs of romance or thrilling adventures, just like any other audience would. When you think about settings and conflicts, nostalgia can be a great and effective tool. So putting games in times and places that might be a nostalgic trigger for that older adult player, and at least give them a world that feels somehow comfortable and recognizable, even if the other things that you're going to ask them to do in that world might be a little bit more unusual. And then thematically, as I was saying, it doesn't always have to be despair, right? So I've seen this wonderful conversation happening in the chat, and I've been trying to keep an eye on the time. So let's go ahead and hit this Q&A section. And so let me just roll back to the top here. First of all, just thanks. I appreciate having so many folks turn out. It's always really exciting in a talk like this because I know not everyone is like, yeah, games for old people.
Yeah, I am.
I don't mean to. This is
back
totally
when I was your age. All we had was a stick and one button, right?
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's see here. Let's pull down. There is something making noise in my other screen. There we go. Let's go down here. It needs larger. Here we go. I need larger fonts as everyone else around me gets younger every year. I know, like on my phone, even I'm like bigger fonts, right? On my computer, I used to have it like the highest resolution, the smallest little, the smallest little folders, and now everything has to be really big.
Yeah,
right?
I just played a great game called The Almost Gone. If none of you have tried that one yet, it's really compelling. And the font is so tiny. And they had font scaling options. And I was like, thank goodness. Because I would have just been like, I don't know. I would have had to go and get a magnifying glass or something because, man, it was so small. But seriously, Dan, to your point, like a big piece of what pushed me to this topic was totally self-serving. I want to be that old lady gamer, who's like 90 years old and streaming on Twitch. And so I've got to make sure that people are making games that I can actually play.
Right. I mean, I'm 51 and I stream on Twitch and stuff, but I don't play I don't play multiplayer shooters and, cause I'm like, I will be watching a CSGO stream and somebody just comes up and then one shot somebody in the head before it's even registered in my brain that thing was even there. And it's already dead. And there's no way I could even do that and succeed. So I'm more like single player, my own kind of pace kind of thing. Okay, here we go. Hey, Robin, any research in Fitts law changes with age?
That is a really great question. I think that one was from Zachariah. So if you're not familiar with Fitts law, folks, if you're interested in user experience research, this is definitely one that's worth digging into. And I would recommend, amongst other resources, a great book called Universal Principles of Design. And so basically, if you're a human-computer interaction person, you're looking at, how would I put it, timing for movement and accuracy of movement, to just kind of summarize it simply. And so, yes, Zachariah, there is some really interesting research that relates changes there to aging. And so one of my favorite recent books that I've read is a book specifically on designing user interfaces for older adults. And so obviously it's speaking about UI sort of broadly, but absolutely applicable to games. And so there's just a ton of really great insights there on things to do and not to do to make a user interface feasible and not a barrier, right? The thing I always think about is I want the challenge that one of my players has from playing a game to be the gameplay, not the UI, right? I mean, unless, it's like Hearthstone and the game is UI, but like that it shouldn't become an obstacle. So yeah, absolutely.
I know that for me, like playing with a controller, unless I'm playing Dark Souls, but playing with a controller, trying to play a first-person game, since I've been playing on the computer for so long, even though I grew up playing consoles, I played every generation of consoles, but when I go back to play our console, it's just hard for me. It's just crazy. Here we go. Christian Wheeler says, I'm 43. Someone just sharing their age right out, bam! And I bought an Xbox and Nintendo Switch a few months ago. Usability nightmare for me. Never was connected to the internet with the old consoles. I got frustrated just trying to download.
Yeah, and I think it's that holistic experience, right? It's not just the game itself, but thinking about your platform of release, thinking about how your player is going to get access to your titles. Just making sure that
I played League of
achievable.
Legends and never felt so old. So much info.
For sure. Yeah, any MOBA or massively multiplayer first-person shooter, I'm like a deer in headlights. It's really sad.
There we go. Font and peripheral vision, motion sickness. Yeah, I get motion. So I'll immediately turn off screen shake on any game. Here we go. Here's a question from Aiko. Is the definition of fairness with gameplay change between age group? What would be the good strategy to keep fairness and accessibility as player customization?
This is a phenomenal question. I do think the definition of what's fair, it varies from audience to audience. And for the competitive multiplayer folks out there, you might hate this idea. I think the key is that in non-competitive multiplayer play, so single player play or co-op play, you have all this huge body of accessibility features that you can make available to people, and it doesn't affect anyone else's experience or performance, and so it's perfectly harmless, and we should do it. But I think even in those competitive multiplayer experiences, outside of an actual, competition, again, I think that the harm we do by not having accessibility options is far worse than by having them.
Kind of like a golf handicap, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but see, then what would happen is because no matter what, you're going to play a 13-year-old kid and they're going to wipe the floor with you, right? So if they have options to adjust it, they're not going to be able to say, oh, well, you're too young to adjust this. So everyone's just going to use those features to make themselves better. And then it would be self-defeating, sort of, I feel.
Yeah, I think it just depends on the kind of options we have, right? I think when you look at things like around, for example,
auto aim, maybe.
Yeah, auto aim, or even just like we're talking about font size or contrast, being able to tailor sound effects versus dialogue. Those kinds of things aren't giving you a gameplay advantage, but are making the game more playable. And so I do think there's a way to work those accessibility features and maintain fairness for sure. Really, really insightful question. Thank you.
I remember trying out some VR at college, and someone made a skydiving simulator. I immediately, even as a student, felt vertigo for a bit afterwards. Yes. Yeah. Like the one where you're walking across a board and it's just like you're walking over a cliff. Yeah.
I can't do it.
I could do it. My wife does not like heights. I think heights are trippy. Okay, let's see here.
They call me the canary in the mine shaft for VR stuff, because if something's going to make people motion sick, it usually takes about 5 minutes for me to start to feel bad.
Not me. I start feeling motion sick right away.
Ooh.
I was a commercial fisherman and for like 5 years, and I had to take Dramamine every single day.
Oh,
yeah, it was not good. Here's a question from Arcillus. I have vertigo just as a regular thing. I hear ringing in my ears when it gets quiet. Ooh, tinnitus. Is that a thing that people with hearing loss hear as well?
It varies depending upon the type of hearing loss and the degree of hearing loss, but tinnitus is something that happens more frequently as we get older. So again, it's certainly something to think about. It's usually intermittent, not persistent, but either way, it could potentially become something that becomes an obstacle, obviously, if you need to hear really sensitively.
I actually have it right now, but it's so soft they can't really hear it. But when I focus on it, yeah, I can definitely hear it.
It's there.
I ride motorcycles too. I need to wear my earplugs, right? That's my problem. Do you observe differences in definition of fairness with gameplay between age group?
Oh, okay. So I think this was maybe a repeat of the question that we had earlier. I do think so. And this is a touchy question, right? Because especially for very competitive players, there's a pride that we take in beating a certain experience or performing at a certain level. And so you certainly have to keep that audience in mind. But I hope as well that we can be mindful of the fact that everyone wants to play. Everyone wants to have an engaging experience.
I remember it wasn't even too long ago where there was no cross-platform like console versus PC, because obviously with a PC you're much more accurate than a console, but they have workarounds for that, and now there's cross-platform. I would love to consider this on, but we have another talk. Let's see. And so if you would like to go into the Discord, would you hang out in the Discord? Okay, discord.gg/indiegamebusiness, and go on over there. Awesome. And let's see, who do we got next? We have Gregory Marlowe, Animate Smarter, tools, tips, and tricks for faster and better animation production. Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll see you over there on Discord. Bye.
Perfect.